Hello, good afternoon. Today our guest is Robert Henderson. Hello, Rob. How are you doing?
Good, Lipton. Great to be here. It's good to see you again.
I am awesome, Rob. I've been wanting to get you for a long time. But Rob, before we start our conversation, tell us a little about yourself. Who are you,
Uh,
Robert?
yeah, yeah. So I'm currently a PhD student at the University of Cambridge here in England, studying social and evolutionary psychology. Before this, I was undergrad at Yale, did my degree in psychology there. And yeah, I mean, before that, I grew up in California and was in the military and had this sort of indirect path to higher education. So yeah, man, it's been a sort of a winding journey, but yeah, that's my specialty right now is sort of social evolutionary psychology. I've also written for major publications, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Quillette, some others on one of my ideas that seems to have caught on, which we can get into as well.
Robert, apparently you are a smart young man, but you didn't start out as a genius. Tell us a little about that story.
Well, yeah, I mean, I had a pretty rough upbringing. I grew up in foster homes in Los Angeles. So my birth mother, she was an immigrant from South Korea, and when she arrived in California, shortly thereafter, she got hooked on drugs and was unable to care for me as a baby. My father left us. I've never met him. I don't even remember exactly when he left, but I was really young. So my mother succumbed to her addiction. I bounced around foster homes in LA. And yeah, I was moving schools every 3 to 6 months, didn't really focus and was just not very good student. And yeah, it took a little while for me to sort of explore my curiosities and figure out my love of learning, simply because my environment was weighing me down. And it really wasn't until I left and joined the military that I discovered that. I mean, in high school, I graduated high school when I was 17. In the bottom third of my class, I had a 2.2 GPA, which is like, let's just say that's extremely low
It means
for a
you're dumb.
typical Yale graduate. Yeah, really low. And yeah, it was let's just say I was not the sort of typical student for one of these fancy colleges.
But Robert, you demonstrate that with great and efficiency one can achieve. And furthermore, Robert, you are providing some further to cultural explanations in terms of the IQ gap, but I must temper those expectations. IQ, as we do know, is irritable. If John Brown is living in an environment that is not promoting academic excellence, more than likely he will not do well. But if he migrates to a better environment, then his scores will improve. However, if John Brown was never bright to begin with, then migrating to a more pristine environment will not necessarily alter his IQ or learning patterns.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think there's whatever, like maybe some kind of whatever ability is necessary but not sufficient to sort of fulfill one's educational potential, right? So if you have a smart kid but you put him, in foster homes and make sure that he never really sort of learns to read and just the kind of circumstances that I was in, then it doesn't really matter like whatever ability is present, simply because they'll never really be able to that whatever the potential will never be able to manifest. But then like once the person say is in a more sort of stable environment, the way that I was later on, and was maybe around other people who were also curious the way that I was, then I was able to sort of find that and explore those kinds of curiosities. I mean, the IQ question, it's interesting. I mean, I've seen this too with others as well, other people who were in sort of bad environments, um, and the potential was maybe apparent early on. I mean, even when I was a little kid, I was like trying to teach myself how to read and all this stuff, the way that maybe some of my foster siblings weren't. So there was something there, but it can still be sort of drowned out unless it's cultivated and encouraged and all that stuff. So there's definitely a lot of nuances there.
So, and another nuance again is that nutrition can affect the quality of learning, but studies do show that malnourished Asians are still relatively intelligent.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I
Yes,
hadn't heard
I've
that.
seen reports of this nature.
Okay.
I was
Yeah,
shocked, but it
I
appears
mean,
that
it's
IQ is really important. But continue.
oh sure. Well, I was just gonna say that, like, I mean, I would imagine even in that case, like if you take that same group of malnourished Asians or Asian Americans and take that group as a control or whatever, and then like give another group of say similar metrics and give them some nutrition, right? Then I would imagine that the group that has access to higher nutrition is probably going to be okay. I mean, this is one of my sort of quibbles. I mean, I like a lot of the research in sort of psychology, behavioral genetics, and that stuff, but I think a lot of people overlook that a lot of like the twin and adoption studies are done on sort of middle class families, but like kids raised in middle class families in developed countries. And seldom do they study like one twin say who's like raised in say foster care, and then another twin who is shipped off to live with like the Rockefellers, right? You don't get that sort of extremes in the environment. Usually what happens is like when twins are put up for adoption, one of them is put in one middle class family, the other is put in another middle class family, and the environments are basically the same, right? So you have the same environment, the same genetics. It's not a surprise that they grow up to be very similar to one another.
I agree with you, Robert, but I'm also flabbergasted as to why some would argue that the black white IQ gap is contentious. On average, whites score higher on measures of IQ than blacks, and East Asians do better than whites, and Jews do better than East Asians and blacks and whites. Personally, IQ is an important predictor of success, but it is not the measure of human worth. I am really interested in IQ and its consequences, but at the same time, it is not outrageous to argue that the black-white IQ gap is a persistent finding in psychological research. Yes, we do affirm the salience of IQ, but if blacks on average are less intelligent than whites, that's not a problem. It does not mean that blacks are subhuman.
Oh, yeah, yeah, man. You'll I'll have to pass on the commentary there. I don't really have a strong opinion on that one way or the other. I'm actually a little bit so just generally speaking, I think that we do put way too much at least like highly educated affluent people put way too much stock in IQ in general as a measure of human worth. I think that you know here's something that I've been thinking about. Like a lot of people say that when kids are raised in sort of unstable environments, something that I write a lot about and I talk a lot about. Um, the reason why this is bad, like they imply that the reason that something like that is bad is because this kid isn't going to uh, go to college. The graduation rates are lower, the sort of their likelihood of getting a good job is lower, their earnings are lower, their rates of criminality might be higher, the rates of addiction are higher for kids in deprived and dysfunctional environments. And I always think, like, why are those the outcomes of interest? Like, why is education the outcome of interest? Why is a good job the outcome of interest? Like why are those things the things that we're looking at? I mean, I think that sort of uh, having a high education, having a high IQ or whatever, these aren't, like you said, metrics of human worth. I think that having a good childhood is a good in itself. Being a good person is a good in itself. There's almost no correlation, from what I understand, from what I've read, between IQ and happiness. And when there are, it's very low. So it's not as if being smart makes you a happier, a more fulfilled person. The relationship between education and happiness is zero. And part of the reason for that is that what seems to happen is that when people get higher levels of education, their expectations rise for their future. So people basically think like, oh, if I get a bachelor's degree, then I'm going to earn more money. I'm going to have more leisure time. Like they have a picture in their mind of what their life is going to look like when they get that college degree. And seldom does the outcome match their expectations. And as a result of this, they actually tend not to be happier. And so this is something else that I often question is like, I sort of bought into this, sort of, you can see from my own life trajectory, like I bought into this belief that like, oh, if I get into the best schools possible, get the degrees, like, this is sort of like what I absorbed is like, this is going to make me happy and fulfilled. But that actually doesn't seem to be what happens is like, I see a lot of people at some of these schools, man, like, they're smart in this sort of conventional sense and all of that. They have all the test scores. They don't seem any happier than a lot of the guys that I grew up with in my sort of, poor working class town. The guys, foster siblings in LA. Like, I just don't see like that much more happiness. At least not as much as you would expect, say. So I think that like a lot of these variables of interest that we talk about, whether it's education or intelligence or credentials, money, occupational success, um, I think it's very telling that that's what elites focus on. In my opinion, I think that's probably they value those things um, because that's what they were taught to value, and really like money and credentials are like the only sources of value that they often understand. And we can get into like my thoughts as to why that might be the case. But I think there are other
We will
things that we could look
eventually
at
talk
for what is a
about
good
luxury.
life.
We will eventually talk about luxury beliefs.
Yeah, yeah, we can get into that too.
Yeah, we're going to talk about it. That will be the essence of our discussion. But I like these prompts that are quite interesting. In relation to IQ and the happiness, some studies do show that IQ is a predictor of well-being, but I do believe that research should be restructured. So, for example, intelligent people may make choices that are more sophisticated over the course of your lives. In other words, if I'm if I'm highly intelligent, I'm not going to respond in an erratic manner to a mere slight. That doesn't make sense. It is infeasible. So over the course of a long life, intelligence may predict well-being. But if we are segmenting happiness based on a particular strata or various aspects, then highly intelligent and affluent people may not be as happy. Depression is actually a consequence of happiness.
What do you mean
Well,
by that?
depression is a depression is a consequence of affluence. That's what I said.
Affluence.
What do I mean by
Uh,
that?
hmm.
It's about relativity. You get a PhD, but your friend with a PhD is a consultant at McKinsey, and their other friend at 22 is writing for the Wall Street Journal. Therefore, if you're
Yeah.
within that particular social circle, you may become depressed. Whereas someone in a poor environment obviously will be more inclined to accept his prospects that do not seem favorable. Therefore, if I know that at 20 I'm not going to get a PhD and at 30 I may never own a home, then why should I be depressed?
Okay. Well, I guess like part of that would be a sort of social comparison, right? Like the
Yes,
PhD
yes.
example that you gave is like, I think that's a big reason. I mentioned before, a lot of the people at Yale and Cambridge and some of these places, like they're not as happy as you would expect. Like, and I remember when I first got to Yale as an undergrad, I was a little bit older. I just gotten out of the military, and I thought that I had made it. Like in my mind, I was like, oh, I got into this great university. Like that's sort of like, I don't have to worry anymore. After worrying basically my whole life until that point. And then I saw like a lot of anxiety in my peers and my classmates, Ivy League graduates. A lot of them are extremely worried, and I think it's for that reason that you're describing, is that they're constantly comparing themselves to, I know you just had Robin Dunbar on. They're comparing themselves to their Dunbar number, right? The 150 closest people to them, who all are baby millionaires, right? Like, they're working on, like you said, they're writing for the Wall Street Journal, they're working in consulting or tech or whatever. Like everyone's doing well around you, and you feel like you aren't keeping up with them, or you're just barely keeping up. And so it becomes this sort of status spiraling game of people trying to keep up or trying to surpass their peers, who are all also like equally bright and ambitious and equally sort of on that, in that sort of mindset of striving. So yeah, I mean, so I guess, like, have you seen any research on this, on depression in, say, lower income countries?
Uh,
Are the rates of depression lower?
of course research exists on the topic, but on an anecdotal level, like if when I do my own analyses, yes, the rates of depression are lower. So for example, in the Caribbean, depression is not a big problem relative to Europe or America. And according to some metrics, Jamaicans are very happy, even though Jamaica is a poor country.
Yeah. Do you think, I mean, you visited the US. I remember you and I met at AI, was it like 4 years ago now?
Yeah,
But
2017.
2017. But I mean, so you've spent a little bit of time around Americans. Do you see any difference in happiness, just on a sort of subjective experiential level, like between Jamaicans and Americans?
Yes, so there is a popular saying in Jamaica, and it's a global saying actually. Jamaica, no problem, man. Jamaica is an easygoing place. In America, to survive, you may work 2 jobs or 3 jobs. America is an individualistic and achievement oriented society, whereas in Jamaica, the spectrum is closer to the side of collectivism. And furthermore, in Jamaica, people can depend on the benevolence of others in order to survive, whereas in America, you must work. And Jamaicans tend to be a bit laid back in their approach to life, whereas Americans move fast. So, for example, there's a relationship between your walking style and levels of ambition. People who are speedy tend to be a bit more ambitious. Jamaicans are very slow. And on a broader level, this could reflect their lackluster approach to life. But this is just my subjective opinion.
Interesting.
But
Yeah, yeah,
Americans
yeah.
take life seriously.
I remember seeing this study. I think it was either earlier this year or last year, but anyway, the finding was basically that they collected, reports of happiness from this hunter-gatherer community. I can't remember which one it was, but it's a sort of modern day hunter-gatherers, and found that they were either equally happy or maybe slightly more happy than like developed Western countries, which was actually kind of a surprise to me, that it was like that. And there was no moderating, like, what was it? Like age and gender did not moderate this, basically saying that like the women in these countries were not less happy, or like basically like if you're a woman in a hunter-gatherer community, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be more or less happy than a woman in a sort of developed like Western culture or something like that. And same with age. I guess like the researchers looked at those questions because they wondered, well, are women sort of in a whatever more unhappy in these sort of communities because of the norms around them, and perhaps like older people may not be as happy. Actually, if I recall correctly, speaking of the age factor, I think age
Older
was a
people are usually
moderating
happier.
factor. I think older people in the hunter-gatherer community were actually happier than older people in developed Western countries. And I think the reason for this was because in this community, this hunter-gatherer community, older people are conferred respect, right? Like they're actually treated as like wise elders or something. Whereas often in Western societies, like older people are overlooked, they're treated very poorly. Like at least in America, I can't speak too much to other countries, but in the US, like, people, the boomers ship their parents off to like nursing homes. They don't really visit them very much. Like there's not that strong, there's not strong norms around ties to older family members, like once you sort of grow up. So I think that was kind of an interesting fact too, that, if you're an older person, you might actually be happier living among a group of foragers.
Well, that finding has been replicated. Research has shown that societies that are closer to pre-modern levels of development tend to be happier. So I'm not surprised by the finding. And I attribute it to community. Such societies tend to place a higher emphasis on community, whereas individualistic societies value the individual at the expense of the group. But the upside is that individualism is actually a positive predictor of institutional quality, governance, happiness, etc., and lower levels of corruption.
Yeah.
So we have to draw the line somewhere. When societies become extremely individualistic, what I would term selfish individualism, then a problem obviously will emerge.
Interesting.
Because remember,
Yeah.
an upside is that under individualism, you are encouraged to affirm the individuality of yourself and other people. Whereas in collectivistic societies, the group is more important than the individual, and the policies of the group could actually be detrimental.
Hmm.
And this is
I
let me continue for a minute. And this is one
yeah.
reason why studies show that collectivistic societies are actually more corrupt.
Oh, okay, interesting. Yeah, yeah. I was gonna say is that I had just read and reviewed The Weirdest People in the World by Joseph Henrich for City Journal, and that book. He basically so he's a Harvard anthropologist, Joe Henrich, and he documents a lot of the differences between weird versus non-weird cultures. Weird being Western, educated, industrialized, rich democracies, and in the non-weird countries, sort of the non-Western, not sort of non-educated, and so on. lower income countries. And one of the things that he discusses in that book that was fascinating to me was sort of the personality differences between weird and non-weird cultures. One of them being sort of how people present themselves to others. So individualistic cultures, I guess like another, sort of roughly speaking, individualistic are more weird and then collectivistic are more non-weird. But individualistic cultures, they they prize authenticity and sort of being your true self. And one of that, like that encompasses being consistent in all of your social interactions. So Hendrick reports research showing that Americans think that you like if you change your behavior in different relationships in different contexts, there's something fake or inauthentic about it. You should be consistent. You should be one person with everyone. Whereas in non-weird cultures or perhaps more collectivistic cultures, it's expected and it's seen as sort of okay to adapt your behavior depending on who you're speaking to. So if you're speaking to a young person versus an old person, an elder versus someone in a position of prominence or respect, so basically, like he found that people that non-weird people view that sort of social flexibility as more, those people, they view them as more emotionally and socially intelligent, whereas weird people view people who are consistent in all social interactions as more socially intelligent. And I found that to be like a kind of an interesting contrast there. I think that like there's a lot of anxiety, I think, in Western culture about sort of being your true self, like staying true in some way. And that if you're differential to someone, if you show respect, if you treat someone differently based on their position or their status or whatever, that they view that as sort of slimy or weird or whatever. Which I guess it is kind of, well, it's actually, yeah. But anyway, yeah, so I was wondering what you thought about that then. Like, do you
Well,
think that this is also something that you've seen?
well, I've actually read Joseph and I've been reading him for a long time. I bought the book, Weird.
Hmm.
And it's interesting that though the book is highly discussed, some reviews are good, but I find many of the reviews to be superficial in the sense that reviewers are basically saying, "Oh my God, Joseph is making these brilliant points. I was unaware, and Western people are really weird." They're not saying, "Well, for a long time, other scholars have been noting personality differences based on geography, and now Joseph is corroborating their assertion." So the gist of it is that, okay, Western people are just weird, and it's funny. So I don't think that reviewers are taking the gravity of the research seriously. But back to your question, Westerners also overrate their abilities and they're more likely to value creativity than conformity. But a downside of authenticity is that human beings will evolve. We're always changing. So in one context, we're authentic, but in another context, being authentic may not apply. And secondly, I don't have a problem with differing based on the context. Easterners have a greater appreciation for context than Westerners. So, for example, respect your elders is not necessarily a bad suggestion. One way to get ahead is to respect people. So, Easterners actually understand soft power to a greater degree than Westerners in some sense.
Hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, so my girlfriend is Malaysian, and she and I have talked about this, about like some of the differences between sort of Eastern and Western cultures. I mean, so I was at Yale during the student protests in 2015 against the Christakises. And, famously, there are these videos in the campus courtyards of the young students, the young undergrads yelling at these professors, like very aggressively, very hostile. So you see like, this 20 something year old young person yelling at like a sort of 50-year-old plus professor. I showed these videos to my girlfriend who's Malaysian, and she was like, this is like, it was just blowing her mind. The idea that like a really young person could not only just yell at an older person like that, but could yell at someone who's in a position of respect, right? Like a
For
full
no
professor
reason.
at
For
a
no
prominent
reason.
university. And yeah, she was like, I just can't wrap my head around this, that like anyone can do that. But in Western culture, that's like totally fine, right? Like it's almost seen as expected for young people to flaunt authority, to be like it's expected, like if you're not a rebel as a young person, it almost seems like there's something wrong with you. And so there's this constant sort of never ending revolution, like the social revolution in Western cultures of like, down with the old generation, we're into this new thing. Yeah, there's a lot of sort of generational conflict, I think we're seeing also in the institutions right now. So yeah, I mean, I wonder though if this is also happening in non-word cultures as well. I
Well,
kind of
not
doubt it.
on the same level. In the Caribbean, political correctness only occurs on the Twitter space. So elites in the Caribbean who want to feel smart, even though they're poorly versed in philosophy in general, tend to cite left-leaning academics who are also equally confused. In other words, it is virtue signaling.
Mm.
But the
Do you-
Caribbean is not experiencing political correctness on this level as yet. But back to the point you discussed with your girlfriend, the students were yelling for no apparent reason. I'm not going to rush the story, but the instructors had a right to promote free speech. So, in a sense, the Western students were not being rebels, they were being children.
Well, I mean, I guess some might respond, well, is there a clear difference between those two? I mean, yeah, that was just a totally strange period, I think. It was tough for me to understand what was going on there, because I agree with you. I think the reaction to those professors was just totally uncalled for. I mean, essentially, for listeners who don't know, though, basically what happened is the Yale administration, right before Halloween, sent out this email to all the students saying, "Be careful be careful what Halloween costumes you wear. Be sensitive. Don't wear anything offensive." Something like that. I'm paraphrasing. And one of the faculty members at one of the residential colleges, Erica Christakis, wrote an email to her students in her college, basically saying, do we really need the administration interfering in our lives? Like, I know you're all adults, you can all sort of talk to one another if you have a problem with your costumes. And the reaction to that email from the students was just totally blown out of proportion. I thought like the reaction was incredibly hostile, and they accused her of defending cultural appropriation. They called her a racist. They called her all these, very ugly names. And yeah, it was just, I mean, that was sort of the beginning, right? There were a lot of protests in the ensuing years. But yeah, the freedom of expression point, I think, is very sort of salient these days, isn't it? But yeah, anyway,
Yeah,
that was sort of I think that was like the canary in the coal mine for a lot of the stuff that we're seeing now with political correctness.
cultural appropriation is conceptually useless. A group cannot
Yeah.
monopolize culture. Culture is shared, learned, and transmitted across generations. So, for example, reggae emerged in Jamaica, but it was also influenced by American music. People who affirm cultural appropriation are silly, uninformed, and just misguided.
Yeah. Well, what was funny is that in that email by Erica Christakis, she got this example of like something along the lines of like, is it really like how disturbing is it if you see a young white girl dressed like Mulan, like the princess, the Disney princess Mulan for Halloween? She used that as an example, and people were outraged by this, right? But then I talked to my girlfriend. She's Malaysian, but she's ethnically Chinese, and I asked her about that. I'm like, would you be mad if like you saw some blonde-haired white girl dressed like Mulan? And my girlfriend was like, I wouldn't, like I think it's kind of funny. I don't, whatever. It's like it's nothing to her. But if you're a student at one of these top universities, you're constantly, what I found is that they're constantly looking for reasons to be upset. They're constantly looking for, in my view, they're constantly looking for weapons to use against their enemies. And right now, I think like sort of moralistic outrage is a very useful weapon.
These students are professionally offended, Robert. So, for example, in the arena of cultural appropriation, reflecting the cultural practices of another culture via dress or food is suggestive of cultural appreciation. Therefore, it
Mm.
indicates that racism is actually on the decline. A white woman who is braiding her hair is saying to the world that I appreciate black culture. She's not a racist, neither is she monetizing black culture. And if she decides to monetize black culture, that is her business.
Lipton, have you seen some of these studies? I think Zach Goldberg might have been the researcher who found this. That so he looks a lot at sort of the differences between white conservatives and white liberals, and he found that like way more white liberals report having zero black friends compared to black conservatives. So put differently, white conservatives are more likely to report having a black friends than white liberals. And sometimes I wonder, like, I saw a lot of this sort of self-segregation at these top universities in a way that I never saw, for example, in the military. Like in the military, I lived in a house and my best friend was a white guy, a Puerto Rican guy, and a black guy. And like, and I'm Asian, right? So there's like literally every like major ethnicity in the US in this one house, and we were all best friends. I rarely saw something like that at like some of these top schools, and people are sort of like cordoned off. And I wonder if like some of that is responsible for a lot of the, I don't know, the vitriol that we see, is like people just aren't mixing, they're not interacting with one another. They're not, I don't know, showing their appreciation for different cultures the way that you're describing here. And I mean, yeah, that could be one component.
Well, and again, the findings of that Goldberg are not strange. For a long time, anecdotally, we're told by conservatives that the average white conservative is more likely to befriend a black person than a liberal. And today we have empirical data. Remember, Robert, white liberals are insulated from minority groups. And when proximity is a problem, you can develop tolerance. So, for example, if I'm a white liberal, I may suffer from white guilt. Black people live in the ghetto, they're poor, therefore, I may blame myself for their sufferings. So, if you're looking at it from that angle, it's understandable why white liberals are likely to overreact because they have internalized guilt.
Hmm. Yeah, that is, I mean, yeah, I think there's probably some aspect of that. I don't know how sincere it is though, honestly, man, like how sincere that guilt is, because there's a lot of performative guilt. I think a lot of like grandstanding and talking about how oppressed this group is, and how they personally very seldom take responsibility, right? They sort of say white people, but they never say like me personally, even though I happen to be a sort of affluent white person, in this example. So yeah, I don't know how much of it is sincere and how much of it is just trying to earn prestige in the eyes of their peers. I mean, one way to think about this is like, if you are an affluent white liberal and most of your friends are affluent white liberals, which we know is the case, right? Like most white liberals, most of their friends are white liberals. One way to gain status in that group is to talk about your white privilege. If you're a white liberal and tell other white liberals you have white privilege, they your status in their eyes doesn't decline, it actually increases. So you can increase your status by talking about how much status you have, which is a neat little trick, I think. But I don't know how sincere, like I don't know how many of these white liberals are actually like going to communities, like actually trying to help people, I don't know, volunteering to help underprivileged kids. I mean, there's a lot of things you can do. Like I'll tell you one thing, like I volunteered at New Haven Reads, teaching like whatever, like poor kids to read, like Yale itself. So Yale is located in New Haven. Of course, it's this fancy university, but New Haven is a very poor city. I think it's majority black, like very poor. There's a lot of homelessness and so on. So I go to this place and I volunteer to read to these kids and help them with their literacy skills. But I don't know, I didn't see that many Yale students like others who talk a lot about sort of helping the community. I saw very few of them, or perhaps maybe zero of them, at this center for tutoring kids. So I wonder like how many of them are actually truly guilty in the terms of like I personally feel like responsible for something and now I'm going to do something about it.
But Robert, why would Yale students volunteer at a charity center? Remember, to get into Yale, they needed to have engaged in voluntary activities in the past. They did so already, so why do it again?
Yeah, well, so I don't know like how much of the extracurricular volunteer activities they did to get in. I think a lot of them probably did like legitimately do um good work for whatever community they happen to volunteer in. But I've also heard, I mean, you've probably read about some of this stuff too, about how a lot of these are sort of makeshift programs simply so that kids can add it to their college application. So I don't know, there's some program where you go to this underdeveloped country, a bunch of aspiring high school students go there, and like pretend to build a fence, and then they can put I built a fence and whatever, installed piping in this poor country, that's how much I care, and then they can put that on their application and they get into some school. So I'm not saying that's how it always is, but that can be how it is based on sort of secondhand stories from what I've heard, from what I've read.
But Robert, charity should begin in America. Poor people exist in America, so why go to Africa? Again, virtue signaling.
Is that I've thought about that too. It's like there's a lot of poor people in the U.S. and why aren't they helping them? Actually, it's funny. I was just reading about this in the mid or late 2000s, I think. There was this like minor controversy because Oprah
Yes,
Winfrey,
I
she
just the idea was just rushed to me some time ago. The Oprah story.
yeah. Yeah. So if we're talking about the same thing, though, the thing that I read was basically Oprah donated a bunch of money, I don't know, a few $1 million or something, to build a school. And I guess she was deciding to either build a school in like whatever, like Chicago or some like, sort of poor area in the US. But instead, she ended up building this school, I think somewhere in Africa. I don't remember the country.
It was South
And the
Africa, I believe.
controversy, was it South Africa?
Yeah, I
Okay.
believe
But the
so.
controversy was something like, why would you, donate millions of dollars to build a school in Africa when we have plenty of poor kids in the US who need help, in Chicago and elsewhere or whatever. And Oprah's response, and you can correct me, but it was something along the lines of like, American kids don't appreciate it. Like they're not, like they don't care about school. They misbehave. They're not focused. They don't care. But I know that these kids in South Africa, if I build a school for these poor kids, they're actually going to learn to read. They're going to study. They're going to work hard.
Well, Oprah's
There's
right.
some,
You can't blame her. Like African children will appreciate these American students. They basically have access to free education. The government will subsidize book material, lunches, and they still don't perform as well. So Oprah's not necessarily incorrect.
So I mean, I guess like I'm not entirely sure. Probably not. This is the reason why sort of striving young students go to other countries. Maybe if you ask them why do you do this, are they going to say, oh, because these people appreciate it more? I
No,
don't
no,
know.
they're not going to say
Uh,
that. They're doing it because they think that it is more impactful.
it's more impactful, and it looks more impressive, right? If you go to Haiti or
Exactly.
something versus if you go to like Appalachia or something, or some poor place in the middle of the country. Yeah, it doesn't have the quite the same impact. Oh, but you don't even have to do that, right? Like I guess you could also volunteer in more urban areas. You can go to I don't know, you can go to the Bronx or something and help kids there. But I guess like you said, it's not as costly of a signal, to speak in the language of like economics or biology. It's a more costly signal to travel thousands of miles to this poor country where like I don't know, you have to like have mosquito nets, and maybe there's not indoor plumbing, and it just like makes a better story versus like taking a train 2 hours and going back home at the end of the day.
But before we commence our discussion on luxury beliefs, I'm just going to list a study. So, a writer for Quillette reported on a study saying that anti-white racist trainings actually impede support for working class whites. I'm just putting out the subject out there for listeners and they can do their own research, because originally we're talking about conservatives having more friends than white liberals. So I think that this is a good supplement.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, but we can talk about luxury beliefs. Robert, you are an expert in this arena. What are luxury beliefs?
Luxury beliefs. So this is a term I coined. The definition is ideas and opinions that confer status on the upper class while often inflicting costs on the lower classes. The basic idea came to me, sort of again, I was this sort of fish out of water as an undergrad, trying to understand everything that I was seeing, the student protests, the sort of opinions that I was hearing, what I was running into. I mean, an example. So I've written about this luxury beliefs idea in an essay in the New York Post and in Quillette. One of the examples I give, I was having this conversation with one of my former classmates who I'd graduated with, and she was trying to convince me that monogamy was outdated and that it wasn't good for society. She said, oh, I think we can move past it and all this stuff. And then I asked her, how did you grow up? Like, what was your family life like? And she told me, well, I was raised, by both of my parents. And then I asked her, okay, so what are you planning to do in your own life? like in your own situation? And she said, well, I'm gonna whatever, I'm probably gonna get married and have a family. And so she was basically saying like, I'm going to live in a monogamous relationship. And then she said, but that shouldn't have to be for everyone. She quickly added that, oh, but maybe it's outdated. I'm going to do it, but I don't think everyone should have to do it. Something like that. And I remember thinking, so that was like an example to me, because if you look more broadly at, say, sort of the out of wedlock birth rates, the declining rates of marriage, kids raised in single parent homes, and so on, all of these family patterns throughout the last several decades in the U.S. I think that those are a consequence of that kind of mindset from highly educated and affluent people. So in 1960, if you look at the number of children who are born into two-parent families with their mother, the birth mother and birth father, in 1960 for the upper class, it was 90%. And for the working class in 1960, it was also it was 90%. I think it was 95%. I'm sorry. So the upper class, it was 95% of children, and for the lower class, it was also 95%. And if you fast forward to 2005, for the upper class, it had dropped slightly to 85%. So it was 95% of children born to two-parent families, and then by 2005, it had dropped to 85%. For the working class families in 1960, it was 95%, and then it had dropped to 30%. So this massive drop off. So basically, the upper class mostly remained the same. The working class, it was just a total nosedive. And so what could explain this? Basically my point here is that, in the 1960s, a lot of affluent, educated people started championing free love, sexual promiscuity, just sort of having fun, not really preaching a no fault divorce and all this stuff. And that had a sort of downstream impact on less educated and less affluent people. It spread throughout society, but they themselves don't adhere to those to their own beliefs, right? These luxury beliefs. Sure, maybe they'll sort of have fun and play around in college, but in terms of how they want to have a family, how they plan to raise their own children, it's it's very like the 1950s. I heard this great line sort of capturing this idea is sort of affluent people, they walk the 50s and talk the 60s.
Yeah, they don't practice what they preach.
Right. Well, they don't preach what they practice. Yeah, exactly right.
But they don't practice what they preach either, because they're preaching promiscuity, but they don't practice it.
Right. Yeah. And again, like I think it's like a narrow window. In college, there's a lot of sort of debauchery and they have some fun and whatever. But then after that, once they sort of get their careers going, then they sort of find a partner, settle down, and take those sort of follow that sequence of having a stable monogamous relationship. I remember, another example of this is I was talking to a friend of mine. He also attends a good university, and he was telling me, Robert, when I set my Tinder radius to 1 mile, basically just the university, the profiles of the girls he was seeing, they're just around the university, and a lot of the bios in the Tinder dating app would say things like polyamorous, just want to keep it casual, nothing serious, these kinds of things. And then he told me when he extends his Tinder radius to like 5 miles to encompass the outskirts of the university and the city that he's in, which is more of a lower income city, he said that the bios he was seeing of the women around there, who were the same age as the young women in the college that he attended, but their bios, basically indicated that something like half of the women were single moms. And so the luxury beliefs of the former group, the types of young people who attend universities, have spread and created a lot of sort of second order consequences, a lot of effects on the group who is sort of less affluent, less educated, doesn't have the same access to social resources. And yeah, I think that there are other examples of this. I mean, we can talk about like defund the police and some of these other movements that are championed by people who are sort of high on the status ladder.
Yes, people like Lori Lightfoot and others in the Democratic Party, like that politician who said that it was a summer of love, they live in communities that are protected by armed forces, whether they be private or public.
Right. Well, I just shared this survey recently. I posted on Twitter. YouGov did a survey. Basically, they asked people. This was in the U.S. They asked people, "Do you support defunding the police?" And they broke down the responses by income category, which I found very useful, because what I found is that the group that is most in support of defunding the police are people that the highest income category that they had, people who earn more than $100,000 a year. So
As
essentially, the
expected.
richest group of Americans are the most in support of dismantling police, right? And again, like you're saying, it doesn't matter for them, because if you're a rich person, you can hire bodyguards, you can hire private security, you already live in a safer neighborhood, but just in case, you also have the resources to hire all these other services. Whereas if you're a poor person, you're already in a more dangerous environment. But now you have no one to call when things go bad, right? And I've also shared this other information too, data from I believe it's from the FBI, showing that people in the lowest income category, like compared to the people in the highest income category, people in the lowest income category are 7 times more likely to be victims of aggravated assault, 7 times more likely to be victims of robbery, 20 times more likely to be victims of sexual assault. Essentially, like if you're a poor person, like the likelihood of you being a victim of a crime is like astronomically high compared to
And this
very
is
affluent people.
and this is why experts often inform us that according to polls, Black communities demand police because they are
Yeah, I think.
vulnerable to violence.
Hmm.
Elites are rarely affected by the burden of their bad ideas. So, for example, a study was done several years ago, maybe around 2004, saying that women cannot have sex like men. A man can bed multiple women in a night, and a woman, if she beds one man or two men, she's going to be emotionally invested in these relationships, whereas men are a bit detached. Therefore, women cannot have sex like men because women rarely have sex without strings.
Hmm. Um, yeah, I mean, I've seen some of the research on it. I mean, that's just I mean, empirically the case. That it's not that women can't do that, right? But on average, men enjoy that more. And what's interesting is that there's this idea. I think it's called the Nordic paradox. But basically, the finding here is that the more gender egalitarian
Yes,
cultures
people are
have
involved
larger
in,
personality
yes.
differences.
So in
Um,
gender egalitarian cultures, women are likely to employed in stereotypically female professions.
Well, not just that, but also sort of their personality and their preferences. The gender gap actually increases. So if you look at the gender gap, for example, in preference for casual sex, or for emotional commitment, or for all of these kinds of things that people care about for their romantic relationships, the gap is actually larger in places like Finland and Sweden than in sort of lower income countries that are less gender egalitarian. Um, so actually, it seems like sort of the more equal the society treats the genders, the more different they become, and the more likely it is that men, for example, actually their enjoyment of casual sex actually is especially pronounced compared to the women. There's also some interesting research too on this is kind of a tangent, I guess, side point of psychopathy and the dark triad. It looks like the more gender equal and sort of economically advanced the country, the larger the gap, the larger the gender gap in psychopathy between the sexes. So it looks like, and it's specifically for men. So in sort of more gender egalitarian cultures, men actually become even more sort of psychopathic in their psychological and behavioral orientation compared to women. It's also kind of interesting.
You can't adjust biology. Robert, based on my research, since the 1970s, studies have been informing us that women can never become men. So even in the 70s, when people were studying the military and the relationship between being a woman and aggression, the studies repeatedly show that on average, personality differences are quite pronounced.
I think that even this belief that there's no differences between the sexes or the genders itself it could be considered a luxury belief, because the effects. So say like this is also sort of tied into the monogamy idea, championing sort of sexual promiscuity. Part of that entails this idea that women can basically have sex just like a man can, and it affects them in the same way that it does men, and that the only reason there are any differences is because of sociocultural influences, which there are some influences, but not as much as a lot of people claim. And so one consequence of this is if you sort of erode or eliminate the norms around dating, for example, um, and you happen to live, say, an affluent and educated community, you can sort of do okay without those norms, right? Like maybe it's a little unpleasant or whatever, or maybe it's even more fun in some ways. But if you eliminate those norms in sort of lower income and less educated environments, you're unleashing something very different. And I'll give you an example of this. I just saw these data from, I think it was from Pew, on experiences on dating apps. I think it was Tinder, it might have been dating apps in general, but basically they broke down the responses by education level for women. So women who had a bachelor's degree and women whose highest level of education was high school only. And they asked these women questions like, have you ever been abused from someone you met on Tinder? Have you ever been stalked or harassed? Had unpleasant experiences, all these sort of like very negative experiences on Tinder. And what they found is that women, the high school category of women, were much more likely to have these sort of detrimental and abusive experiences with Tinder partners compared to the educated women. And I think this is just like a sort of, one, it's sort of the environment that you're in, right? Like on average, men who are less educated and have lower incomes are just going to be on average more violent. They're going to be more unpleasant to be around for women. They're not going to be great romantic partners. Uh, not to say that those things don't exist in more educated communities, but it's just more pronounced. And so before, in the past, when you had like these strict norms about like how you're supposed to treat someone, what are the gender norms? Like, what does it mean to date someone? What does it mean to like the norms about having sex with someone and all these things, right? I think a lot of that constrained behavior, especially sort of young men and the way that they interact with each other and with women, um, those norms were important, those sort of cultural guardrails, especially for sort of less educated women, right? Like if you're an affluent woman, you can champion all of these things and remove the norms, and maybe life will be pretty fun for you or whatever. But if for lower income women, it'll look much different for them. What like sexual freedom in the age of dating apps, clearly there's a difference there, and they're not having it looks like, based on the results that I saw there, it's not the same experience for those two groups by any means.
So clearly, women in certain environments require benevolent sexism, chivalry, as we would call it.
Well, I mean, that's
Well,
interesting, right? I
well,
mean, it sounds like you've
well,
seen the studies, right, on
yeah,
benevolent
yeah.
sexism that
Women do prefer
women
men
like them.
who are sexist. So, for example, ladies before gentlemen is a sexist term. If we're all equal, then please allot the food equally. If a man is in front of the line, serve him first. Do not say ladies before gentlemen. You ought to be logical in your application of feminism. Secondly, if you need assistance lifting load, do not ask men, ask women. Obviously, men are physically stronger, so it makes sense to ask men. But if men and women are equal and I'm in the workplace, do not ask me to assist you with the load. Why not ask the woman? Because men and women are equal. And that's the problem with feminism. It's incoherent.
I remember I saw this. I think it was a study on this sort of benevolent versus hostile sexism, and one of the findings, it was something like men who do not act in a way that is benevolently sexist. Like you said, like the ladies first, sort of like offering to pay on dates and these kinds of things. Um, Men who don't do those things are seen as hostile. So there's like the benevolent sexism and hostile sexism. And if you know, at least according to the results of this study, I don't know if they sampled both men and women or if it was just women they surveyed. But basically, if a man does not act in a benevolently sexist way, then people perceive that man to be sexist in a hostile way. So, you know, I guess like one interpretation is like sort of damned if you do, damned if you don't, that kind of thing.
And that's why
Yeah.
and that's why I ignore feminists, because in private conversations we have discussed the issue, Robert, and as you are aware, I am driven by data and I like logic, and logic does not seem to be the strong point for a feminist. And because we are having a public discussion, I have to be nice. But had it been private, I would be particularly hostile. And you know this.
Yes, I do know this, Lipton. I know you.
Yeah, I'm a
So
very
yeah, I
hostile
mean,
guy.
yeah. Well, yeah, I think that like a lot of the yeah, it is strange to see that you know, a lot of the beliefs in sort of the public conversations are often at odds with findings in data and dating preferences. Um, you know, it's just how it is, right? And so I think like young guys are often sort of getting mixed messages. Maybe some of them are confused. I think women are confused too. I actually just shared this article from BuzzFeed, uh, titled, and it was actually a good article, something like Gen Z women think that sexual positivity is overrated. And basically, like they interviewed a lot of young women, you know, sort of in their late teens, early 20s, and these women were just like basically saying, you know, basically, it's coming at me in the culture. You know, this one woman, she said, you know, on HBO and pop culture and media and so on, that they're sort of pushing young women to have sex, commitment-free, casual sex. And I, you know, this woman was saying, you know, I did that for a long time, and I just wasn't, I didn't feel good doing it. Like I actually, you know, I had a lot of unpleasant experiences, sort of living the life that I was told I was supposed to live based on, you know, TV and pop culture and so on. And I think it's sort of sad, right, that like, you know, all these messages we're getting actually are making people less happy in their relationships. um and I think like maybe a lot of people would probably be better maybe they would be happier if they just sort of stuck to like maybe some of the older dating
Yeah,
norms around sort
monogamy.
of.
And Joseph Heinrich has actually done studies on the topic, and he has cited studies, and this work is corroborated by other findings. Monogamy is associated with less crime, stronger
Okay.
families, and the higher saving rates. People in monogamous society are more likely to save, especially men. When you're living in a polygamous society, it's very hard to distribute resources equally. So polygamous societies are less likely to see, because men who are at the helm of the household must allocate resources among different groups within one family. And polygamous societies tend to be more traditional and patriarchal. Some economists actually argue that polygamy is a barrier to economic growth in Africa.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I mean, I like from everything that I've seen also indicates the same. You know, I read Henrik's work. I read some of the other stuff too about how, yeah, it's just generally a more stable community, right? I think France Duval has also written about this,
Yeah,
the
France
benefits of sort
Duval.
of the rise of the nuclear family and human communities, and how this basically like, you know, once everyone was sort of guaranteed a romantic partner, there's less sort of instability and scheming and striving, and like it's also a better environment for kids too.
It reduces
I read this. Yeah.
intergroup violence, especially, and we have
Right.
data for European societies.
Intra group, right,
Yeah,
within the
in
group.
intergroup violence. So for example, because it was easier to access women, ordinary men were less hostile to the elite in Europe. If elite men are able
Okay.
to monopolize women, then the average man will become angry and he may revolt.
Yes. Yeah. So if you have, you know, I think, yeah, Henrik has called this the math problem, right? Where if you have a society of 100 men and 100 women, and then, you know, like, you know, 10 of the men monopolize all the women, then you have 90 men without any women, and they're not going to be a happy, you know, a happy group of young men. Um, I've also seen this work. I don't know if she was the sort of researcher on this, or she's just reporting this in her book. Joyce
Henderson,
Benenson.
okay.
Yeah, she's great. And she's discussed, you know, women who live in polygamous relationships, right? Like a bunch of women living together, partnered with one man, and they are often quite hostile to one another. The way that they treat the children of the other women is often, not very nice. I've read about, attempts to poison them and sort of or and less severely, sort of like deny food or curtail certain access to resources. And so, like, I guess, like, you could have like an evolutionary perspective where, like, women are trying to, especially in sort of maybe less developed communities, economically speaking, that they're trying to maximize the resources for their own offspring. And if this requires sort of curtailing the access for the offsprings of the other women, then maybe that's better. Which I guess is why Franz de Waal, the primatologist, has said that, like, the nuclear family was a good environment, and it was a sort of very positive innovation for human
Yes,
communities.
some actually link the nuclear family to the rise of capitalism. So people like Alan McFarlane and Peter Laslett, they have done research on the subject matter.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah,
because
I'm
remember,
sure.
the nuclear family promotes individualism and achievement. It's separate and
Mm.
apart from the extended family. In the extended family, one is under the traditional authority of the patriarch, whereas in the nuclear family, one must exit the home in order to achieve. So,
Well, I think that
so, so,
extended, yeah, the
so,
extended family is
so as a
different than.
consequence, the nuclear family could actually promote market-based preferences. But continue to make your point in relation to the extended family.
Well, so the extended family is different than like a polygamous household, right? Like, if you're living with, and I would imagine, like, even from an evolutionary perspective, if you have like a bunch of blood relatives, a bunch of kin living together, that's different in terms of how they're going to treat one another versus living in a home where there's like one man and five women and all of their children. Like, it's not the same thing as an
No.
extended family, right? Of like having aunts and uncles and grandparents and so on,
No,
where everyone is a blood relative.
yeah, an extended family is a very large family. It transcends the nuclear family. So, for example, a polygamous family can be nuclear, one man, 20 wives. It is not
Hmm.
one man is uncles and their girlfriends and sisters. So, a
Yeah,
polygamous
where and
family can be nuclear in that sense.
hmm. Yeah, and that extended family, they're related, right? The uncles and aunts and cousins. Like,
Yes.
there's a sort of there are those ties to one another. Whereas, like you said, if there's one man and 20 women, well, those 20 women aren't related to one another. And so they may not necessarily be so kind the way that extended kin might be
Yeah,
to one another.
and those 20 women are subservient to one man, not to the patriarch.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
the extended family is more patriarchal. But Robert, this is the conclusion in relation to your argument about luxury beliefs. And you have noted this in many of your pieces. Elites care more about social status relative to ordinary people, and
Hmm.
social status is actually a better predictor of life satisfaction than absolute income. We like to compare ourselves to others, and this is why luxury beliefs do persist. And on the flip side, ordinary people mimic the elite. They value expert opinion. This is what research has shown. Ordinary people take the views of experts seriously. So we don't need to tell them to trust the experts because they are already trusting the experts.
Hmm. Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, so that research is fascinating. I mean, it's been done, Cameron Anderson at Berkeley and some others who found that upper class people, so the higher up you are on the status ladder, the more you care about status. So there's this positive relationship between current position and how much you care about that status, which is maybe counterintuitive, right? Because you might think that people at the bottom of the ladder are the ones who want
Yes,
status the most,
yes.
who want the money, who want the wealth, who want the position and the prestige, but it's not the case. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think that's an important component of this. And then, yeah, I guess, like, yeah, I didn't really finish like going deep into luxury beliefs, but basically, so that's one component of it, is that the upper class people care a lot about status. And historically speaking, if you read the work of like Thorstein Veblen and Pierre Bourdieu and some of these like old school sociologists, they wrote about how the upper class signals their social position through their material goods. So through their clothing, through the garments, through wearing a pocket watch and a monocle, the kind of sports they play, if they go golfing or beagling, all of these sort of costly material indicators of one's position. Um, that's how the old elite used to display it. But today it's not the same, right? Like you can't necessarily display status with material goods. I think it's considered kind of like gauche or vulgar to wear really nice clothes or to sort of like drive around and display your fancy car or something. An example I give is like 100 years ago, if you walked through the streets of Manhattan, you could very quickly point out who was rich and who was poor just by the way that they were dressed. Whereas today, if you walk around New York City, like, you can't really tell who's homeless, who's rich. Like in some cases, you may even confuse them. You might even see someone you think is homeless, but they're actually a millionaire. Um, or maybe like San Francisco would be a better example of this. But basically, like you can't really tell by appearance anymore, or at least not as well.
But
And
you
so
know,
how do the upper class display their status? It's with their beliefs. It's
yeah,
with having
luxury
unusual
beliefs.
opinions. Yeah.
But Robert, the National Bureau of Economic Research did a fascinating study arguing that people are skeptical of those who critique pro-COVID measures. So the truth is that despite what we're being told by the media, the average person is actually consistent with anti-COVID-19 measures, even though many of them do not work. So for example, the evidence purporting the efficacy of facial coverings is actually quite dubious. There are many serious studies refuting the argument that there's a relationship between facial coverings and fewer transmissions.
Oh, yeah, I don't know about, I have no opinion really on this one way. I mean, I've seen, the expert opinion, I guess. Well, it's funny. Initially, it was, uh, don't wear masks. I think there was even this kind of the conventional wisdom was if you wear a mask, you can actually increase your likelihood of infection because you're sort of fumbling with the mask and you're putting it on and taking it off,
And
and
that
so
is
you're getting
true,
your fingers in
Robert.
your face.
You should change
Uh,
the mask like every four you should change the mask after 4 hours. You shouldn't be wearing the same mask every day or every week, but most people don't have the time to buy a new mask. So either
yeah.
way, the mask policy is flippant, because if masks do actually curtail the spread, the average man is not frequently changing the mask.
Okay. Yeah.
It's a
Yeah.
bit
I mean, like
defeating.
I've seen this. Yeah, I have friends who are, I think at first they were very alarmed with what was going on with COVID, and then more recently they've become, sort of more relaxed in their position toward it. And yeah, they're wearing the same mask for like the last 2-3 weeks in a row. Like they're just generally less concerned about
So for example,
it.
in the open environment, transmissions are over 0%. Therefore, if you're not contacting or communicating with other people, you don't need to wear a mask. But
Hmm. Okay.
well, some states in America are no longer imposing the mask policies, but in the developing world, it is gaining traction. But the evidence is not strong at the moment.
Yeah, it's interesting. In California where I'm from, I know that they were closing like the beaches and like the public parks, at least in the beginning. I think they're open now, but in the beginning they were closing them, and there was no evidence for, basically being outside in a public park or on the beach was contributing to transmission. But Andrew Gelman, he's I think he's a social scientist or statistician at Columbia. He wrote something interesting, basically saying that this is a signal of seriousness. So if you close down the beaches and the parks, it's the government communicating to the people that this something serious is going on. We need to take this measure seriously. Don't take COVID lightly, whatever. And so it's basically like a costly signal of seriousness. Which I mean, I guess like maybe, but like, is that worth the trade-offs of having
Exactly
people
my
stay at
point.
home?
And the National Bureau of Economic Research did a study. The long-term implications of COVID-19 lockdown measures will be deleterious. From a cost benefit analysis position, the cost of COVID-19 measures outweigh the benefits. Furthermore, most people who contract COVID-19 will not die, neither do they require hospitalization. COVID-19 will be around for some time, therefore, we
Hmm.
must adjust. I do not
Right.
appreciate the hysteria.
Yeah.
It is becoming unbearable.
Yeah. I think well, we may see some renewed some renewed basically because of the Delta variant. I think a lot of people are getting worried about that. Yeah, it's been interesting. Well, politically it's been interesting to see the lines flip. In February and March of 2020, what I saw was political conservatives who were highly concerned with this outbreak, and political liberals seem to be more relaxed or more skeptical of it. And then, at some point, I can't even, exactly when this divergence occurred, but then suddenly political liberals became the ones who became very worried and alarmed about COVID. And then the conservatives were the ones saying, well, this is not a big deal. Maybe it was at the point of the lockdowns, actually, that conservatives weren't a fan of the lockdowns. And then over time, the political liberals were. But yeah, this is just in the US, by the way. I'm not sure the situation in Jamaica.
Well,
How is
look,
the situation
I'm
there?
glad you refer to Jamaica because I'm data driven and the evidence does not support lockdowns. The Jamaican government imposed lockdowns and then they were eased for a bit, but unfortunately the numbers went up. When the numbers went up, the curfew was lowered to 8 p.m. It was once 11 p.m. But this is my problem with Jamaica. The politicians in Jamaica are basically a waste of time. They're not citing data. They're not engaging in analysis. They're only speculating. So, for example, there is the perception that the numbers went up because Jamaicans like the party, but I'm yet to see a study arguing that there is a link between parties in Jamaica and transmission. So until then, you're just wasting my time. And this is why I don't listen to Jamaican politicians because I don't like to waste time.
Okay.
And Jamaica is a poor country, Robert. Jamaica has recorded an exceptionally slow rate of economic growth over the past 40 years. A country like Jamaica cannot accommodate a lockdown. That is just stupid.
Interesting. So you think that basically the cost benefit is not worth it for the lockdowns because of economic reasons, which I
Yes.
mean, it was funny because we heard a lot of those arguments in the US and the UK about, is it worth it? Is it worth it? And perhaps the cost benefit, like you're saying, it's actually you have to treat it differently based on the sort of whatever,
And
how far along
people
the country is economically.
people must be held to account for their own health. If you want to stave off COVID-19, go and do your research and identify the correct food and vitamins to consume. You must be
Yeah.
accountable for your own health.
Well, so it's interesting. A lot of a lot of people who are like really into fitness, they were questioning this. They were saying like, we know, for example, that obesity is a contributing risk factor for COVID-19, but none of the governments are telling people, get some exercise, try to eat healthier, like try to whatever, like try to get your, like, manage your weight, get it under control. Like it's none of that, right?
and,
It's kind of interesting to
and
see
Robert, there
that
are
that's
actually
not helping with that.
researchers who are studying the link between exercise and COVID.
What's the link there?
Yeah, well, so far it is tentative, but the research is new. I'm yet to read them. I've only read the abstracts. That's why I said they're researchers. They're new researchers. So the research is from 2020, 2021. So it's a bit early to judge. But so far, the evidence is in the affirmative. Exercise and healthy lifestyles can prevent one from contracting ailments. And in the event that you get ill, your immune system is better positioned to fight off the disease.
Interesting. Yeah, I'd wondered, it was, people were making jokes about this too, about how, well, they shut down all the gyms, but they're leaving the liquor stores open. People can get boozed up at home by themselves, but they can't sort of work on their fitness or their health. I guess, like, I think the
Yeah,
expectations of people are low.
but Robert, our last point, maybe the most controversial point of the discussion, the sex recession. Robert, our generation is having less sex when compared to our fathers and grandfathers. Years ago, when I was a student, the Economist magazine published an article titled "Those Staid Young Things," arguing that young people at the time were having less sex. However, Robert, there is a dilemma. Money cannot explain the sex recession. We do know that women prefer high status men, dominant men, and highly educated men. So, for example, on dating apps, women are likely to prefer men with advanced degrees. But the evidence is also informing us that social status is not the best predictor of the sex recession. And my hypothesis is quite novel. Neither do I affirm the argument that men are having less sex because they're distracted by video games. I contend that men are having less sex because they are less interested in sex and in women. In other words, the modern woman is overrated. Yeah,
Well, um, so those data are interesting anyway. So about the sex recession, I think it might have been that Economist piece. There was also a piece in the Washington Post showing that young men, the number of young men who have not reported having sex in the last year has tripled since 2008. So in 2008, it was something like, I want to say it was like 10% of men under 30 reporting no sex in the last year. And then by 2018, it had jumped to about 30%. And for women, there was a slight increase too. I think it was like 10% and then jumped to like 15%, something like that. But yeah, I think the rise in sexlessness, it seems to be primarily concentrated
by
among young
men.
men.
Yes.
And perhaps, maybe they're finding women less attractive. But I think
They're
there's
no
a lot of
longer,
stuff going on.
there are a lot of issues, but I do believe that men are no longer drinking the female Kool-Aid. So for example, I saw two articles in a financial publication. Article number one, a man: my girlfriend got a raise, but I'm still paying for dinner. Is she fair? Of course she's unfair. Your girlfriend is a parasite. Second
Oh,
article.
wow.
Yeah, she's a parasite. Remember,
Yeah.
Robert, I'm a traditional person. Therefore, I do believe that men ought to marry women and invest in their children and their wife. However, because of feminism and liberalism, men and women are equal. Therefore, if men and women are equal, then they ought to be responsible for an equal share of financial liabilities and responsibilities. That makes perfect sense. If women are saying that men and women are equal, yet men are still picking up the tab, women are basically acting like parasites. Second article: I have 1 million, my girlfriend has 20 million, but she wants an expensive wedding. And the man more than likely will be forced to foot the bill. My advice to that man: don't marry her.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, well, in general, I don't know, man. Like, I think you could argue that this goes in both directions. Like, just generally, the behavior of young people has declined in terms of the way that they interact with each other. I mean, so I think that a big reason, so it could be that maybe men are less interested in having sex with women now. Some of that I actually do think is driven by some of these other things, like porn has gotten like too good. I mean, I think like a lot of young men are spending more and more time using that. Perhaps, they're finding women in general less appealing. I think another thing is the way that the dating apps have sort of reconfigured the romantic landscape such that, like, it's funny, like in the mid 2000s, I think in 2008, it was still kind of creepy to meet someone through online dating. The norm was you meet in person, but if you meet someone online, it's kind of this interesting novel thing, but it's also like, oh, you could meet someone creepy from the internet. And now it's actually the reverse, where the expectation, the default is, I mean, and then I'm speaking from the Western perspective, maybe things are different in Jamaica, but it's like the default is you meet someone online through a dating app, through an internet website, whatever. And if you meet someone in person, there's something creepy about that, about like, oh, you met someone, some guy asked you out at a coffee shop. Is he okay? Is he a creeper? Like, have you looked him up? Have you Googled him to make sure he's okay?
I get your
Like,
point, Robert. I get your
yeah.
point. So, for example,
So I think, like, yeah, guys are using apps more, and women are swiping on certain guys, and the vast majority of guys aren't receiving any matches. So just very quickly, this piece of data from research on Tinder showing that on average, men like, swipe right. They like more than 60% of the profiles they see on Tinder. They like 60% of them or more. Whereas for women, they only like about 4% of the male profiles they see. So those 4% of men on Tinder are accumulating the vast majority of the likes.
Robert, I love what you just articulated, and let me explain why. I'm an introvert. I like intellectual discussion, but I really don't like interacting with people outside of business. Secondly, my business, Robert, is my business. I'm not going to share my achievements with people on Twitter. And you can attest to this. If I have achieved something great, you'll get an email. I will not put it on Twitter. That
Yeah.
doesn't
Yeah.
I
I see those.
Yeah, I'm uninterested in Twitter and the profile of people on Twitter. I prefer to meet someone in real life and have a conversation to determine if he or she is worth my time. We live in a very shallow society.
And I think, yeah, there's this flattening of romance and attraction now, where your first impression of someone is a 2D image on, you know, the 6-inch screen. Like that's what you see now when you sort of meet someone for a potential sort of romantic relationship, right? Like that's the first thing you ever see about them. Whereas in the past, I think, like, you know, maybe someone is not the most super attractive or the whatever upon first sight, but then once you sort of get to talk to them and get to know them and like experience their whole person, their whole personality, it may be a little bit different. But now, because it's so driven by image, like the superficiality and the shallowness that you're describing, where now it's like you have to take the perfect picture with the perfect bio, um list your school, list your occupation, sort of like give all of these details that may not be the most interesting parts of you online, hoping that someone else out there will respond to that. Whereas maybe if you meet in person and you can actually speak to someone, it will capture sort of these qualities about someone that can't necessarily be measured or quantified or whatever, or displayed on a 2D screen.
Robert, Twitter is for people who don't have stuff to do in the real world. So, for example, I follow your Twitter page, but I rarely respond. Why? Because I'm busy. I work full time, have a YouTube channel, and I'm always reading. In order to prepare for my interviews, I have to read. I cannot interview a bright person and end up sounding like a jackass. Therefore, the losers perpetuate nonsense on Twitter because they don't have much going on for them in the real world.
Yeah. Well,
So
I can't always, disagree with that. I'm
yeah,
pretty active on Twitter, but I
no,
also block a
you're an
lot. I'm
academic,
very
Robert.
careful.
Robert, you're an academic. You're posting mainly academic research on Twitter. That's the difference.
Yeah.
You're
Yeah.
not
Well, I
engaging
mean,
in
I try
idle
to do that.
chatter. That's the difference. That is the difference. So you're not really active on Twitter.
That's yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, yeah, this is just sharing different information, but I mean, well, Twitter's an interesting thing. Just seeing like what people are willing to disclose about themselves and their thoughts, and every sort of inane thing that enters their mind. A lot of people will just share it, and it's I don't know. Sometimes it's not always helpful.
Yeah, they're mindless robots.
Mm.
Yeah, but Robert, last point. More young people are identifying as gay. So the LGBT lobby is growing. And feminists along with their liberal peers, will regret it that men are now more open to bromances and homosexual relationships. And I'm going to explain to you why. There are gender differences in personality. Women are more likely to conform than men. Men are more individualistic than women, and men are also more extreme in the sense that they're likely to to expose views that are eccentric and are disregarded by the wider society. So if more men are identifying as gay or bisexual or questioning, at some point these men may become true homosexuals, and as such, women may not have the relevant partners. So I think that feminists will eventually begin to lament the ascent of the male homosexual.
Uh, okay, interesting. So, well, I mean, there's research on gender ratio imbalances, right? And how in communities where there are more women than men tend to behave more poorly, simply because, like, if men have more selection, more options to date around, then they tend to sort of not adhere to women's expectations of them. And the reverse is true. So if there's more men than there are women in those communities, often men actually adapt to women's preferences. And so, for example, a lot of colleges, there's a surplus of women relative to men. More and more girls are going to college compared to young guys. And psychologists like David Buss and others have posited that this has contributed to the rise of hookup culture, where if there's like a sort of small number of men and a large number of women, then the women are actually implicitly competing for the attention of the small number of men. And because men tend to prefer more casual sex compared to women are more willing to have whatever. So if it's the case that more men become uninterested in women, then the dating pool for women will shrink over time. and then this could create dating problems for them and sort of narrow their romantic prospects. I mean, they're already pretty narrow among educated women. Uh, the author John Berger, I think is his name. He wrote this book Datonomics. He did a deep dive into this, and I report a lot of this data in an article for Quillette, basically showing that among I think it's among women under 35 with among people under 35 with a bachelor's degree. So just people under 35 bachelor's degree, there are 3 women for every 2 men. So basically what this means is that like if every young person with a bachelor's degree partners up, every heterosexual person with a bachelor's degree partners up, then something like a third of those women are not going to find a romantic partner. And because like you're saying, like men on average are more likely to identify as exclusively homosexual relative to women. And if more and more men do that, then the prospects will look even more gloomy for young women.
So for example, Robert, Black women are encountering an insurmountable challenge. And let me explain to you why I'm saying this. There is a relationship between homosexuality and intelligence, and we have known this for over 40 years. Secondly, the link between intelligence and male homosexuality appears to be stronger. It has been replicated. The link between female yes, it appears to be stronger. The link
surprised me.
Well, it surprised me to an extent. The link between female homosexuality and intelligence is a bit inconclusive. Black women are having a problem because there is a shortage of Black men. Too many Black men are in prison, and also Black women are less likely to engage in assortative mating because they're less educated Black men. However, educated Black men, on average, the pool of educated Black men could be smaller than the pool of educated white men. But because of the link between male homosexual, are you following? Because I'm looking at your face. Because of the link, because of the link between male homosexuality and intelligence, the pool of educated Black men who do not want to have sex with women could be larger. And as such, this will pose a problem for Black women. So Black women often say the good men are either in prison or gay, and they could be right. So for example, I don't know if you track the profile of successful Black men in America, but many of the really articulate Black men in the States who appear on news channels are gay. And I've counted more than 20. Many of them are not straight.
Oh, interesting.
So
the only one I know of is Don Lemon.
Well, Don Lemon is a newscaster, but like some of his guests. So, for example, Keith Boykin is very smart and also gay. LZ Grandison, Kwame Anthony Appiah. So I was sitting down once and I said, I don't like to speculate. Let me just do a mini study. And I just kept counting prominent Black men who are gay. And this is a problem because the pool of available Black men is smaller.
Oh, yeah. I mean, like in general, of course, like anytime there's a sort of dearth of options for any group, like that's going to be, I mean, like I'm trying to think of like the equivalent for men, like if you say like, if a large chunk of women are not interested in having sex with men, then that's going to be like a lot of men are not going to be happy with that situation, right? And so we're talking about the reverse scenario here. I mean, I don't know. I think a lot of people don't think in those terms, right? Like I think they're not really, a lot of people aren't aware of like gender ratio imbalances and how that can affect the dating landscape. They're not really aware of like how education affects this, social status. I mean, all of these things play a role, right? Like on average, women tend to prefer men who are 4 to 5 years older, slightly more educated, earn more money than themselves.
And women also prefer straight men. Men are likely to enjoy, yes, you're laughing, but it's true. Men are likely to enjoy short-term relationships with lesbians because they're able to join in the sexual activity. But women prefer their men to be straight. They don't want to be guessing. But men don't have a problem with bisexual women because it's sexy to some men.
Oh, right. Yeah. That's a good point. I mean, I haven't seen any studies about this, but my intuition is that
but there are studies arguing arguing that men to an extent prefer lesbian, but I don't know if their studies are making the point that women dislike gay men. There's some
Well,
anecdotal articles, but not quantitative or meta-analysis.
yeah, I mean, like, just whatever, being a person, right? Talking to my guy friend, talking to being a guy in general. Like, I think there's this, a lot of guys like the idea of women sort of being with other women and so on. Like, that's something that's exciting to a lot of men. But I sort of doubt that women get excited
No,
in the
they
same
don't.
way about like their male partner hooking up with another guy or something like that is probably not as exciting for
Yeah,
them.
and
So
and Robert, when you and I do read the New York Times weddings page for many reasons, and one reason why I track the page is because I want to check the dating patterns of black homosexual men, and a good place to start is the New York Times, because the New York Times is only featuring highly educated black gay men, and many of these men are marrying outside of their race to white men.
hmm.
Yes, this is
Oh,
also quite
okay.
interesting. And and
Okay.
again, like for example, you pointed out Don Lemon. Don Lemon is often dating a white guy. There was Michael Sam. There is Ryan Russell, and I can go on and on. Many of
Well, this
them are.
is way way outside of my like
Yeah, yeah,
area of
yeah,
knowledge, but
yeah. Like
yeah.
it sounds weird, but at one point I said I need to truly study this topic, and I was floored by the data.
Hmm.
But I
All
am
right.
truly sorry for black women. However, if black women marry outside of their race, they can solve the problem. And according to Pew, black women are unlikely to marry outside of their race when compared to other races and black men.
Hmm. Okay. Yeah. Just totally outside of my knowledge base here,
Yeah,
but
but
yeah,
interesting
it is
stuff. But
interesting. Yeah, it
Robert,
is.
unfortunately, I have to say bye because I've been
Okay.
speaking for a long time.
We
All right,
have,
then
yeah.
bye.
All right. Thanks, man.
All right.